Natural capital, well, what is it? Well, I looked at the natural capital roadmap and their definition is it's the goods, in other words, the things, the stock of renewable and non-renewable natural resources like water or soil carbon, I should say. And it's also the services that flow from them, things like irrigation, things like pollination, things like environmental health. And these goods and services have, as you all know, public and private benefits, but there's clearly overlap between the public benefits and private benefits. So, for instance, water, the public benefits could be things like environmental flows, could be recreation, could be town water. The private benefits could be things like irrigation and watering your garden, but they could also be environmental flows for your own particular area. They could also be your own enjoyment of recreation and getting your own water in the town. Now, as farmers manage about half the terrestrial landscape in Australia, they're responsible for the management of much of our terrestrial natural capital. And they can bear a disproportionate share of the financial burden of conservation for all Australians. And so I guess the real question is, who should pay for that conservation and how much of it should farmers actually conserve? Now, a Productivity Commission research paper in 2001 pointed out that if property rights require a user to meet an environmental standard and the user doesn't, the user can be considered to generate external costs, and on efficiency grounds, the impactor pays principle should apply. But if the cost of implementing that were to outweigh the efficiency advantages, then the beneficiary principle can be considered. So it sounds a bit like what's most convenient at the time. But if the community expects a higher standard than is required under existing property rights, then the government government could change the property rights. But we've all seen the challenges that, for instance, when governments start to change land clearing legislation and make it stricter, we've all seen the challenges that that imposes, and one might question sometimes whether it's as effective as people might want it to be. Or governments could alternatively consider the beneficiary pays principle, and so government might meet a share of the costs, sufficient to trigger additional conservation by the private sector, for example, things like fishery buybacks, water buybacks, bush tender, and land care projects. It's quite clear in the current environment, I would have thought, that the community and thus governments expect a higher standard of conservation of natural capital than is required under existing private property rights. Again, the Productivity Commission in 2017 observed that requiring governments to fund conservation helps discipline them and their demand for conservation on private land. Because if governments just demand that people do it and they don't actually pay for it, they risk treating it as a free good, and for them then more is always better, especially if you don't have to pay, more is always better. And further, where governments choose to allocate land for conservation, they should provide adequate funding to meet the objectives of the conservation, including things like controlling ferals and weeds which can affect adjoining private properties. Now, market-based approaches, which are quite popular, can incentivise conservation on private land, which has both public and private benefits. The MDB water buybacks are an example, and they delivered public benefits through improved management of water resources to meet environmental flows and provided farmers with a financial benefit. Now, some farmers also received funds for on-farm efficiency improvements, which also had public and private benefits. Other examples include the New South Wales Biodiversity Conservation Trust, which delivers conservation benefits on private land and is probably one of the longer-term examples of government funding long-term conservation of natural capital. And beginning with the decade of land care, the Australian government has funded projects to incentivise conservation for 25 years or more. Now, in a review of the EPBC Act and its interaction with agriculture a couple of years ago, I recommended that the Australian government establish a trust explicitly tied to the Environmental Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act to support protection by farmers of the matters of national environmental significance that the Act is there to protect. Through the adoption of market-based approaches that incentivise farmers to protect and maintain matters of national environmental significance rather than doing it all through regulation and expensive offsets. So, for example, management arrangements with farmers like the New South Wales Biodiversity Conservation Trust, where governments buy conservation management arrangements for a period of time on a piece of land. Under offsetting arrangements, where the cost of offsetting arrangements would be covered by, at least in part, by the government. Direct purchase of environmental protection and biodiversity conservation outcomes. through the acquisition of land. And all this, in my view, should be done according to some kind of strategic approach rather than a bit here and a bit there, which we often seem to see. And the last area that seemed to be relevant for this particular trust was compensating farmers invaded by endangered or threatened species, and then farmers weren't allowed to harvest their crop, like, for instance, Carnaby's cockatoos invading a pine plantation, which had been set up for timber. Now, the recent establishment of a $30 million pilot agricultural biodiversity stewardship program, which will see farmers paid for improving biodiversity and for sequestering carbon, is an example of government policy seeking to address cost sharing for matters of environmental significance. Now, when the Climate Change Authority in 2018 looked at the policies that Australia could use to meet its Paris targets in the area of agriculture, we recommended more research into the multiple benefits that could result from well-designed policies on the land. For example, increased biodiversity, carbon sequestration, reduced erosion and increased productivity that might come from planting a shelter belt for livestock. A lot of the programs these days address one matter under one program, another matter under another program. It's almost like today a farmer makes a decision about the environment, tomorrow he makes a decision about productivity, and the third day he makes a decision about conserving biodiversity. So it's really trying to put them all together and have single actions that actually produce multiple benefits. So we looked at the barriers to farmers achieving these multiple benefits through single actions, and what we concluded was the barriers include things like cost to farmers of participating in government programs, limited availability of finance for investment, challenges coordinating the many different government and non-government players that deliver policies on the land, and the lack of metrics to support policy development. Because everybody does it differently, and theirs is always the best one. Now, among other things that we recommended were a new targeted investment fund for the land to provide finance for farmers on farm activities that deliver multiple benefits. And what we suggested was a land and environment investment fund along the lines of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation Fund, which generates a commercial return on loans and which could build up metrics and provide access to finance and, in the long run, have sufficient data to encourage other finance institutions to enter the market. Now, another example of a program is the Queensland Government's $500 million Land Restoration Fund, which encourages management actions that deliver multiple benefits, like facilitating projects that deliver environmental benefits at the same time as increasing carbon storage in vegetation and soils through an emissions reduction fund project. I guess my observation about a lot of these government programs is the programs are good, but they tend to be short-term. They tend to be not really have a strategic basis, and other than the New South Wales Biodiversity Conservation Trust. So it would seem a sensible approach to actually have some kind of strategic basis on which this land is managed and have it long-term. So as I understand the New South Wales Biodiversity Trust program, often those contracts go for 100 years. So unless you have long-term programs, you have conservation for a while, and then if the property might change hands, who knows what the future might be. Now, as well as government programs, increasingly higher standards around sustainability of natural capital are being imposed on farmers by large companies in the supply chain in response to changing consumer preferences, as well as international trade negotiations. And developments in this area have the potential to affect Australian agricultural exports. For example, the EU is developing a number of frameworks to identify and preference sustainable production that might affect Australian producers exporting to this market. The EU criteria for sustainable finance, the green taxonomy, and the EU framework for a circular economy include separate reporting on the environmental footprint of products, and that could affect Australia's exports. And this shows the importance of farmers being able to demonstrate their environmental credentials. Government support for frameworks to help farmers demonstrate and certify Australia's agricultural sustainability credentials can assist farmers maintain market share, open new markets or attract higher prices, all the while incentivising sustainable behaviours. The government's recent $4 million allocation to develop a sustainability certification scheme is the type of policy support that is needed to incentivise the ongoing production and management of natural capital on farms. Lastly, a couple of words about climate change. It's reducing farm profitability in the absence of other action in Australia. ABARES last year found changes in climate since 2000 have reduced average broadacre farm profits by 22%. And I think the Commonwealth Bank, in some of their scenario analysis, found that in the absence of rainfall, grain growing between now and about 2060, the profitability of that would drop about 50%. However, smart land practices can enhance climate resilience, and often this involves activities that build natural capital and win for farmer profitability and the environment. And there is data to support this through an ANU-led farm profitability study, which found that graziers can maintain profits while enhancing natural capital. The Australian Government recognises these synergies, and from July this year, $100 million will be available each year to invest in projects, including those that build drought resilience and improve natural capital through the Future Drought Fund. Projects must enhance the public good by building drought resilience, and examples could be restoring natural vegetation for soil or water retention or for carbon sequestration. And there are very likely to be private benefits in these projects as well. And the Consultative Committee for the Future Drought Fund saw that building up environmental services or natural capital could become a major source of additional income for farmers in future years. Thank you.